Good morning, Lorraine. How are you? Good to see you. Good morning and welcome to Grace St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Memphis, Tennessee. I am Holly Rencher, a member of the clergy team, and so glad to welcome those of you who are joining us online today. We are privileged to welcome Otis Sanford. Otis, a journalist and political commentator. He does so much in the community, but also a professor at the University of Memphis. Otis has been to Grace St. Luke's several times and is a friend of the parish, and we are delighted that he will engage us in a conversation entitled Preserving Respect in a Season of Polarization. We can all relate to the fact that on lots of levels people are divided and polarized and often stuck for different reasons, and Mr. Sanford does a brilliant job at engaging people in the conversation. But before we begin, I'll open us with prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, in the gift of this new day, we gather as people of faith in this sacred space for a sacred conversation about how we might be in better respect and understanding of one another. Thank you for all who have gathered both online and both in this room to be a part of a conversation with Otis Sanford as he brings his gifts, as he brings his insight, and as he always is speaking from a place of faith about which he is very proud. Be with us today as we engage and give thanks for community. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Friends, join me in welcoming Otis Sanford.
Thank you so much.
Are you on? No, you're on.
Am I on now? Yes, I am. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here again. As Reverend Otis said, I've been here, I know at least 3 times, I believe. Usually I'm hanging out with my good friend here on the front row, Dan Conaway. He seems to get me into more trouble than I get into myself. So we've been a sort of a team going around over the last couple of years. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. I always feel like the greeting and the hospitality here is just so warm and genuine that I never could say no whenever you ask me to come. So thank you so much, Reverend Ali. And this is a very important and crucial time to ask me to come and talk about the subject today. I'm going to couch this under the title, The Erosion of Civil Discourse, because it is eroding, and also the media's role in either preserving civility or destroying it. And I want to also say that it's good to see some other good friends in the audience, people that I've known, the Bowers over there, and the judge who used to be a lawyer and got me out of trouble at the newspaper whenever we wrote something that could get us into some legal hot water. Judge, then lawyer John McCullough was always there. So John, it's good to see you as well. I want to make sure I leave plenty of time, or at least enough time, for a few questions or feedback. So I'm going to try to speed through what I want to talk about here. But I also want to make sure that I cover this well, because this is a very crucial, important topic for us to deal with. Some of you may know a little bit about my background, but those of you who don't, let me give you some context here about where I come from. As you can tell, I'm an African-American guy, and I grew up on a farm in Mississippi. in the 1950s and 60s. All you have to do is think about that time, think about that place, and think about me. And you get an idea about my worldview on issues. Believe it or not, I always wanted to be a journalist. Ever since I was like 3rd or 4th grade, I didn't even know what the word journalism meant, but I knew I wanted to be a writer. And I was encouraged by that, by my parents. My mother was an English teacher before she raised 7 kids. But my father was a carpenter who only went through 6th grade. But he loved newspapers, and they brought the newspapers home every day. And we took the commercial appeal by mail, and I just poured over it as a 6, 7, 8-year-old. And so I always wanted to do this for a living. And I've had the opportunity to do it for so many years. My first job, though, my first professional newspaper job was in Jackson, Mississippi, at the Clarion Ledger. And in my first years, I never really covered anything that was controversial because even though we were coming out of the civil rights movement, so to speak, in the mid-1970s, things were calming down. And we had, I believe, from my point of view, we had a lot more civility. In fact, the most controversial story I think I covered in my first full year as a reporter, some of you may remember this name if you're old enough to remember it. There was a guy in the Nixon and Ford administration named Earl Butz. I see Dan is already laughing here. You remember Earl Butz, don't you, Dan? Earl Butz was the Secretary of Agriculture. And in 1976, John Dean, a White House lawyer during Watergate, served some time in prison for it. When he got out, he became a writer for Rolling Stone, I believe it was. He did an interview with Earl Butz, Secretary of Agriculture. And believe it or not, and I had forgotten this when I went back and recall specifics here, Pat Boone was sitting there listening to this conversation between John Dean and Earl Butz. And John Dean asked Earl Butz, why is it that Republicans are no longer getting the African-American vote? And he gave one of the most vilest, cruelest, bigoted, racist comments that you could ever give. And of course, I'm not going to repeat what he said here. If you want to know what it is, you can look it up on your own time and away from the house of prayer. But he said it. Pat Boone heard it and flinched. John Dean published it in an article that ran on October 4th, 1976. 3 days later, Earl Butz was gone. The White House, the Republican White House, the Republican leadership, everybody was absolutely incensed by what Earl Butz had said and told him, you cannot survive this. There's no way for you to denigrate a race of people like that and survive. And so he resigned, as he should have, because that kind of mentality should not be a part of our federal government in any form. Again, I was a young reporter, and I wrote a story about it. My editor in Jackson wanted me to do a reaction story, talking to civil rights leaders in Mississippi and agricultural leaders, Republican leaders, and that's the story I wrote. I even had a chance to interview the iconic Aaron Henry for that article. But that was a period in time when civility was a lot better than what it is now. And our leadership, even though we may have or you may have disagreed with a certain administration or a certain policy, civility was beginning to take hold or had taken hold post-civil rights. So where are we today? And my argument is that we are in a bad way because civility is to me, going out the window. And of course, back in 1976, that was long before social media. And it was a time when civil discourse, even though we disagreed, was there. Remember, it was Howard Baker of Tennessee who insisted that Nixon resign because he didn't think the country was going to stand for dishonesty in the White House. That was a different time. So where did things change? Where did they go south? Well, a lot of people think it went south with the 2000 election, one of the closest elections we've ever had between George W. Bush and Al Gore. And that could be, it could be. Although Gore conceded after a legal battle that went to the Supreme Court. But I remember 2008 very well, and the election of Barack Obama. I was fortunate enough to go to Washington for the inauguration of Barack Obama in January of 2009, and it was the most amazing thing that I'd ever seen in my career as a journalist. I was in a sea of about 1 million people. I mean, if there had been a stampede, I don't know what would have happened because there were so many people there. But that was the biggest example of a unified country that I think I had ever seen in my whole life. Growing up in Mississippi, going through segregation, at the end of the civil rights movement, doing everything that I'd done in my career, but to be there in that crowd, and that crowd was about as diverse as you will ever see in America. And you know, it was cold, it was bitterly cold. We found an opportunity to get into a Starbucks, and everybody was crowded in there and nobody could get waited on. And some guy started complaining, and then everybody jumped on that guy for complaining because he said, hey, this is no day to complain. This is a good day in America. And that guy shut up and didn't say anymore. That was the temperature that we had on January 20th, 2009, but it didn't last. It didn't last very long at all. And so we have to ask the question then, what went wrong? And this is not a partisan political statement. This is a fact. Things really started to go wrong with the rise and the election of Donald Trump. And that's just a fact. I am not a partisan politician. I'm a partisan journalist because I do speak my mind. And I believe that the rise and election of Donald Trump is what has exacerbated our incivility in our public discourse. Now, we've had incivility in this nation going all the way back since we were a nation. But it always seemed to me that the top leadership, for the most part, always found a way to prevail over hostility. The top leadership did. Truman did it. Eisenhower did it in Little Rock. Johnson and Kennedy did it with the civil rights movement and voting rights and civil rights. Even Reagan, at his core, was a decent guy who abhorred outright racism and bigotry. But unfortunately, Mr. Trump fostered it. Some would even say he curated it, but he certainly reveled in it for selfish means. And this is where we are today, with the kind of incivility not really seen since the civil rights movement. And the media, you could argue that some portions of the media share in that responsibility, because sometimes it's more about ratings than it is about truth-telling, or it's more about the bottom line than it is about building consensus. And as a result of that, the media the distrust in the media is really at one of its all-time highs. I did a search yesterday, Reverend Ali, and I looked at a Gallup poll that showed that only 34% of Americans believe that they can believe what they read, hear, see in media, just 34. 38% say they have no faith, no belief in what's in the media. That says a lot right there. And so the media, we have to ask ourselves then, what are we doing? And as I see it, the problem is that, again, we care more about the bottom line. We don't do as much fact checking as we should. The voices who are trying to bring truth and accountability and independence in reporting, they get drowned out, and they're the ones who will call fake news. But what I see going on now is that the fostering of incivility is now coming from the top down rather than from the bottom up. Because if it comes from the bottom up, we should have leaders in politics and media who will be able to just cut it off, like Eisenhower. But if it's coming from the top down, then it's only going to spread when it gets to the average citizen who wants to believe in division and hostility and all of that. We now have election deniers and even people who are slavery deniers, either in public office or running for public office this year, all over the country. And it's hard for me to tell what drives them the most. Is it their own bigotry? Or is it the fear of the bigotry of their voters and they don't want to upset them? I don't know what the answer is there. But I do know that legitimate media should continue to do what we can to fight back and create a more civil climate. I might irritate people from time to time. But I'm doing my best to seek the truth and report it, to minimize the harm, to act independently, and to hold our elected officials accountable. That's what we are supposed to do. That's what I've always tried to do as a journalist. But it's becoming harder and harder because people are so entrenched in their beliefs. And they find comfort in those beliefs online and on various social media sites, which, does no good. Now, social media is fine for a lot of different things. It has helped us do our job in real time and in better ways and reach another audience. But there are some areas of social media that is just vile. And it's been co-opted by people who traffic in conspiracy theories, who just love to, stir up things and say the most vile things that they possibly can say. I found it interesting just 2 days ago when Elon Musk took over Twitter. There were some people who, let me test this now and see how much vile stuff I can put on Twitter and then see how long it stays. That's the era that we're in. And so it is important that we have courageous political and community leaders, but we also need media leaders who, despite the criticism and despite the polling that shows that they distrust us, we must be willing to continue to do our jobs and do it responsibly. And I might add that those of us in the faith community, and I count myself as Pastor Ollie said, I count myself as a faithful member of the faith community. And it's important on us to seek civility in our civil discourse as much as possible. Continue to search for the good, the common ground, because I believe it's still there. It's just sort of being trampled down these days by hostility and discord and even violence, as we've seen very recently. I consider myself to be an equal opportunity offender. I criticize Democrats as well as Republicans. I criticize white residents as well as African Americans, and the far left as well as the far right. So I figure as long as I'm irritating everyone, I'm probably doing my job pretty well. But it was the French writer Voltaire who famously said, I may not agree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. But he also says something else that I think is even more profound. He said, and of course he was using the male gender here when he said this, but this applies to everybody. Every man is guilty of all the good he did not do. God gave us the gift of life. It is up to us to give ourselves the gift of living well. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. That is so true. That is absolutely true. That last sentence sums up, I believe, where we are today in our world. And I know you all join me in doing whatever you can and whatever we can collectively, based on our faith, based on our belief in human good, that we will try to eliminate those absurdities so civility will not just live, but will thrive, and as the young folks say, will rock. Let me say one quick thing, because I know I want to leave some time for some questions. We have an election coming up in about 9 days now. It's not getting that much attention in Tennessee. It's getting a lot of attention elsewhere. I think it's still crucial that we all take time to vote, even though the polls and the pundits say that this is a foregone conclusion. There's not really a lot out there for Tennesseans to vote on. That doesn't matter. The vote is sacred. It needs to be protected. It needs to be utilized. My dear mother, who lived to be 101 years old, was not able to register to vote until she was 54 years old. And she was one of the first, I think she was either the first or second African-American woman in Panola County, Mississippi to register to vote. And she always took that vote seriously, and she voted right up until the year that she died. Every opportunity to get to the polls in wheelchairs and walkers and whatever, she did it. And so I will never let any election, whether it's foregone conclusions or not, I'm never going to let that pass me by without voting. And next year, we have a very crucial Memphis election. And Dan and I were talking about it very briefly before we started. And I made the point to him, and I've said this before, that this will be the first regular Memphis municipal election, regular election. I'm not talking special elections. It'll be the first regular election since 1971 in which there is not an incumbent running. We tend to keep our incumbents, or we did certainly before term limits. We tend to keep our incumbents in office for quite a while. But this will be the first one regular election since 1971 when Wife Chandler was first elected. That means this is a very crucial election for the city. And there will be so much said and done and written and reported and aired about this election over the next 12 months now. Election is in October of 2023. And I encourage you to pay attention to it. Those of you who live in the city, get ready, evaluate these candidates, because this is really going to be, I think, a crucial election for the future of the city. And you can bet I'll be paying attention. And probably to some of them's detriment, I'll be paying attention, but I'll be doing that. I do want to stop there and engage in some dialogue here about this issue, because again, it really bothers me when I see so much incivility in our public discourse. When people have no reluctance to resort to vile name calling and even violence because they don't like or they believe something. As Voltaire said, if you believe the absurdities, you will commit the atrocities. And so that is really one of the things that I care most about. But I do want to engage in some dialogue, so please feel free to either comment or ask me a question.
Good morning. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
My question is this. I have teenagers, and they have come up in the world of cable news and social media and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think cable, I shouldn't only keep it at cable. News in general has become the crossover and the bleeding between opinion television and true news is difficult to discern, in my opinion. So, knowing that the attention span of a teenager on a good day is about 30 seconds, can you give me the elevator pitch of how to discern a true journalist who is doing all the rigorous, I don't know what you call it, but going through the process, due diligence and all of that, versus those who don't do that? So what should they be looking for, and what should they respect when they're looking towards a news outlet?
Thank you for that question. I'll answer that question by prefacing it this way. 3 years ago, I had a wonderful opportunity to go to Germany and teach at the Gutenberg University and talk about media and the media's influence in this country, which they knew a lot about. And one of my presentations had to do with how cable news has helped to divide America. And that is true. When you look at cable news, especially at night, it's all about opinion, which I say bleeds more over into entertainment and not news. What I would suggest, there are some very credible news sources that you should try to push your children toward. One of them would be something that they probably can get their hands on fairly quickly, NPR. NPR does a fabulous job of deep reporting, and they stay away from the bias. Now, obviously, again, I am an opinion journalist, so that's what I do. And there's room for opinion, as long as it is informed opinions. Dan, we both write columns for the Daily Memphian, but we just don't get up in the morning and say, well, who am I going to offend today, and not doing the research to base my opinion on?
No, I don't know.
Well, I don't think we do. But I would send them to listen to NPR sometimes. Listen to Morning Edition or All Things Considered or some of their specials. And then I'm a biased guy, so I go toward the traditional newspapers and news sources that have always done journalism the way journalism should be done. Now, you might believe that they are maybe on the liberal side, but sometimes when you are a journalist and you're holding the powerful accountable, you might bleed over to being a little bit more liberal. So I say, New York Times is the best newspaper in the world to me. And they do a thorough job of reporting and holding people accountable. So it's those traditional news organizations that I would be sending your children to get the real news, and stay away, especially from things on social media that are not giving them, they're only giving them opinion.
So I want to poke at you a little bit and say, what is it that NPR, New York Times, the credible sources, what do they have to do differently? I feel like it's things like verify sources 3 times or something like what specifically do true journalists do that others don't?
You just said it.
Is that it? It's verifying
check,
sources.
double check, triple check.
Okay. Thank you.
If they, try to get all sides of the story, but sometimes there are no 2 sides to the story. That was said, I didn't make that up, that was said in the book about the integration of Ole Miss. And the reporters there, they said, look, there's not another side to this. James Meredith trying to do what a citizen does, and we have these people over here rioting and killing. There's no two sides to that. But as much as you can, you try to get as thorough of a report as possible. Do the research, put context in the story. That is what that's what we as journalists were always trained to do. All the way from high school through college and throughout professional life is to do the research and report the facts. Seek the truth. That's the number one thing in the code of ethics of journalists. Seek the truth. And if you do that, you can stand on that no matter how people are sniping at you.
One here and then one there.
Okay?
Thank you for that, and I love the sources that you referenced, and I listen to them and try and get my recently post-teenage kids to listen to those.
Okay.
You've articulated the things that we can do as parents and individuals, and what journalists can do as individuals. What is your thinking as to what the media industry itself might be able to do to get back to a place where we collectively have a sense of where to get true non-alternative facts?
Yeah. I think the main thing that the media collectively as an industry can do, they're not going to do it, but I'm going to tell you anyway. They need to stop caring all about the bottom line. It's not all about profits. It should be about public service. There was a time when newspapers, which is what I know, newspapers didn't care all that, well, the people in the newsroom didn't care all that much about the bottom line. We had other people, the business people cared about that. But see, that was at a time when newspapers flourished. That was at a time when the profit margins of most newspapers was like 35%. A 35% profit margin when grocery stores were allowed to have 4 or 5%. You can tell where we were then. And so we didn't care much about whether we offended our advertisers or whether we were losing money or because we weren't. We were making money. We had classified advertising that money just poured into the building. We were flush with cash to do what we needed to do, and we didn't care even if we upset our largest advertisers. And I worked at newspapers where we did that. We won a Pulitzer Prize in Pittsburgh by doing an investigation of an airline, which was one of our biggest advertisers, and they cut off advertising. And the editor said, well, I don't care. We're going after this story. We have to get media organizations, corporate organizations, to stop caring exclusively about their bottom line. But that's hard to do because most of them are public companies. They have to adhere to shareholders, and the shareholders want to profit. And if the shareholders want to profit at a time when they're already losing money in advertising, then they have to cut corners and they have to do what will placate their advertisers. But that's what has to happen. They have to stop thinking about the bottom line and start thinking more about civility and inclusiveness and reporting and seeking the truth no matter what. Yes.
I have 3 comments.
Okay.
One is, I wonder if we perhaps had too much democracy in this country with respect to the primary system, because by and large, the most extreme positions are the people who vote in the primary system, and I think that's really contributed to the polarization that we've got right now.
I hear you.
Another thing, I think social media has certainly contributed to the lack of civility. And I particularly remember, I forget her name, there was a young African-American columnist who was with the Commercial Appeal for a while, then went to Baltimore. What was her name of it?
Wendy Thomas.
Right. I heard her speak one time, and she said she would get these incredibly insulting, horrible voicemails.
Oh, absolutely.
And she would return the calls, and when she started talking to the person, the tone changed completely.
That's right.
And with social media, there's anonymity, there's no actual engagement with the people on the other side of the conversation. And so that's another contributor to the lack of civility that we've got right now. Mm-hmm. The third thing I'll say is I am a major NPR consumer and contributor. I'm a sustaining member, and I look forward to your commentaries every Friday morning. But I would add one thing to what you say. NPR definitely has a slant, if not an agenda. And to me, a big part of media bias is not so much or only with respect to how a story is reported. It has to do with what stories the editors choose to report.
That's true. I
do watch Fox News, and one of the best things on television actually is called Fox News Sunday. We record it, we watch it after church, so it's on at 8 o'clock on Sunday morning. Mm-hmm. And there are stories you're going to hear on Fox News you will never hear on NPR or on CNN. Right. And often they're biased, but sometimes they have an important topic or point of view that needs to be considered. So I would add to what you said, you need to listen to various news sources, and some of them are going to make you mad, but it's important to look at different and listen to different news sources in order to try and get a thorough picture of what's going on.
Thank you for that comment. I'm just going to respond to one of them, and that is that primary system that you talked about. And while it is true that our primaries, federal, state, even local, have devolved into these very partisan extremes, I don't think the problem are the primaries. I think the problem is we don't have the leadership. We don't have the ability of the people running for office to impact the electorate. They are allowing the electorate to impact them. And that is why we have such extreme views in partisan primaries. But the other thing is the way we have gerrymandered districts, not just in Tennessee, but across the country, in which the politicians have picked their voters, rather than voters picking their politicians, have also created this as well. Now, I don't necessarily disagree that NPR does have an agenda, but I think that agenda is one that's rooted in civility, honesty, truth-telling. I've never seen an instance where NPR, and I'm spending a little bit more time on NPR because I just think that they do such an in-depth reporting on the things that they do write about or air. And I just think that they do such a good job at that. They are trying to get the truth out, whether this is agenda laden or not.
I have always thought that the shift in civility occurred in the 90s with Newt Gingrich. I'd like your thoughts on that.
That's a good point. 1994, Newt Gingrich came to power with his so-called contract with America. That is when Republicans took over. This was during the Clinton administration, and Republicans took over both the House and the Senate in a real big way, and he became sort of this kingpin. Yeah, I mean, you can make an argument there, but that had no effect on the 1996 election, though. Voters still elected Bill Clinton, whether you should have elected him or not. They still. And Newt Gingrich, his influence and his power was pretty fleeting as a result of that. But yes, that was a turning point, and it probably gave people the belief that maybe we can have some impact. Maybe the extreme views can get some air. But I still contend that it was not until after the election of Barack Obama, the rise of the Tea Party, the rise of Donald Trump, and all that he stood for in 4 years that really exacerbated the division and the discord that we have in this country. I just believe that.
Question here? Just one comment, and then see if Otis agrees with this. We haven't mentioned yet, but I think the basic problem is a 24/7 news cycle. We never had that before until media has become what it has become.
Right.
And if you are charged with the responsibility of building an audience and holding an audience for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you're going to find stories that are on the air far longer than they deserve to be, if they deserve to be at all. And you're going to, the term clickbait that we've invented is a very real thing about writing headlines and leads that will get you to watch or read, and then continue to do that. We sink to our lowest common denominator, and this is a cynical statement, but I think it's true about a vast amount of the stories we read. It just like what we do as individuals, we talk to people, and because we want to get along and not fight, we will talk to the opinion at the moment around that table, and we will try to be polite about it. But we will agree around that table, whether we agree or not, we will do that to continue that conversation. Well, the cycle does some same thing. It puts us in silos of agreement, where we live with people that agree with us. And we listen to stories about things that we are all interested in. And we have opinions that are backing up the other opinions that we have, and we continue to do this. And it fosters what we have as a problem and what we have in communication. It's hard to tell the truth if the truth disturbs. But the truth remains the truth. And you can't invent it, but that's what's happening more and more, in my opinion.
I agree with that. And let me just add one quick thing to what you just said about there are some stories that stay on the air much longer than they should. That is absolutely true. You got 24 hours to fill. You don't have a lot of new news going around, so you just recycle one story over and over and over again. Just the other day, there was a hot mic incident with Chuck Schumer and talking to President Biden, saying he was worried about the election down in Georgia.
15 seconds.
Right, and it really wasn't much to it, but it just kept getting aired and aired and aired that day, and then into the next day, and then the new anchor that comes on saying, this is what's going on. I mean, do we need to hear?
Six talking heads.
Exactly, and then they have to get analysis on that. I mean, it's a waste of time. And so I agree with you. We spend far too much time rehashing, and because they have that 24 hours to fill. Yes.
It was actually rather timely this morning. For some reason, the CBS Sunday morning was on while I was eating breakfast. Mm-hmm. And I looked up and there was an interview with a lady whom, unfortunately, I missed her name, but she was described by the interviewer as a very prominent editor, both at the Washington Post and then later at the New York Times. Mm-hmm. And the discussion was about bias in the news. And the interviewer asked her if she thought that newspapers and other news sources, I guess they were probably thinking about hers, were too biased. And she said, no, I don't think they're biased enough. I wonder what you would have said to her if you had been the interviewer and she made that remark.
Well, I would certainly ask her to explain what she meant by that. We're not biased enough. That's kind of one of those statements that is rife for misinterpretation. It's almost like defund the police. I mean, what are you talking about? And nobody was able to really explain what that really meant. It was just a bad slogan to use. I'm not sure that I agree with that. I do agree that we should seek the truth, though. I do agree that sometimes there are no two sides to the story. I do believe that. But I'm not going to couch that in the terms of saying we're not biased enough. If what she's talking about, we should be biased toward truth-telling, fine. But I don't think she said that. At least, did she say that? I don't think she did. I just think that that's unfortunate and a mischaracterization of what journalism should be about. We're not trying to be biased. We're trying to go after the truth, and if the truth offends somebody, or the reporting offends somebody who does not believe at all in what we're saying, well, then we just have to shake that off. Like he said in the New Testament, just shake off the dust and keep on going. But I don't think she should have said that without some context to it.
I wish she had amplified it.
Yeah, I wish she had too, yes.
So the journalist, the soon-to-be and became Memphis journalist Ida B. Wells said the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth on it.
Exactly.
I'm wondering if she has had any influence on you and her story, and if you just care to elaborate.
Yes.
Please.
Tremendous influence on me. I included a prominent chunk of her in my first book, Boss Crump, King Willie, just because of her courage. She was such a courageous person at a time when it was dangerous to do what she did.
I don't know if everybody knows who she is.
Ida B. Wells, I hope everybody knows who Ida B. Wells is. Native of Holly Springs, Mississippi, came here as a school teacher, became a writer, formed a newspaper called the Free Speech and Headlight. Three of her friends at the People's Grocery Store in South Memphis were arrested and lynched because they were competing against a white grocery store owner in the same neighborhood. And she was incensed by that. And she used that as a way to start reporting on all the lynchings in, not just in Memphis, but in the Mid-South. She got run out of town, really never came back to Memphis, but went on to be a very powerful journalist and civil rights leader, one of the ones who helped to start the NAACP in 1909, lived the rest of her life in Chicago, absolute hero of mine. And I was thrilled when we finally got a statue of her down on 4th and Beale Street, near where her office used to be. She is absolutely an inspiration of mine, not only because she's a Mississippi homegirl, but because of her courage in journalism. Thank you for bringing her up. Yes.
Moving just the least bit away from civility and the lack thereof, could you briefly address the phenomenon of Christian nationalism?
Christian nationalism. Wow, that's a good one. That's a good one. I'll do the best I can on that. There are some forces among people of faith who believe that there are certain things that they believe in and want to have done that are so important that I'm willing to ignore and excuse other things. What I mean by that is there are some who are among, as you call them, Christian nationalists who just flatly reject abortion, or they flatly reject, there's a whole lot of issues. I think abortion is one of the main ones. And they would be willing to support someone whose background, policies, mannerisms, speech, actions are counter to everything that human nature stands for when it comes to the good. They are willing to ignore that in order to get that one thing through. And that is true of a lot of people who are, quote unquote, Christian nationalists. I can think of no other example of that than just down in this election down in Georgia. I mean, we have two candidates running for Senate in Georgia. One is beholden to the Republicans and will likely, if he's elected, just be a backbench person voting the way the Republicans want him to vote. And his hypocrisy on that very issue of abortion is just striking. But there are so many people, especially people in the faith community, who have said, I'm willing to excuse that because we need this vote. That is one of the dangers of not looking in a broad way at who it is that we are electing, what policies we should go for, and whether we are being fair and truthful to everybody. And I think that's one of the issues around that, Christian nationalism. Yes.
Thanks for that, and thank you for this morning. As a journalist, where do you draw a line between professional and personal life? for politicians? Like, where does it go too far for
For
you?
politicians or
For
me?
politicians, for you, as you look at it, like, what's news? Is
Yeah.
it, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. Obviously, I do believe that politicians, for the most part, they do have a personal life. And there may be some things that, as journalists, we don't invade. But it's not all that much, because when you hold yourself out to the public, and I'm using the term public trust. When you want the public to trust you to make decisions that affect our lives, our pocketbooks, our children, everything about us, we put it in your hands because you're the politician, you're the senator, you're the congressman, you're the president, you're the mayor. Well, then what you do and say and have done and said is a matter, it should be a matter of public record. So I don't draw that big of a line there, because I think, again, when you put yourself out and ask the voters and the public to trust you, we have to trust that you are acting in an ethical, above board way. And when you don't, we have a right to know what the situation was. That's my best answer to that. Yes.
To me, the height of incivility is violence.
It's violence, absolutely.
And also, to me, violence is not the answer. And you posited that influence comes from the top down.
Right.
We had a president who advocated violence.
Right.
Prior to the current one that we had. Do you think that our current leader is helping get us closer or move us in the right direction towards understanding that violence is not the answer? Or is there something we can do locally in this mayoral election that's coming up to look to that? We have a big issue locally as well.
Well, I mean, I think our current president certainly is polar opposite of the immediate past president. I think he has done and said what he could do and say to bring us back to some level of civility. The unfortunate thing here is that the anti-Biden forces are so strong, so deep, and so entrenched that they're not going to listen to anything he says. It's just like a scratched record. Nobody's going to pay any attention to it. And I think, unfortunately, that's the case with him. It is just so important, and I say this all the time, and I have lost friends among politicians as a result of this, by calling them out for lack of leadership or for capitulating to a crowd that believes in violence or is willing to resort in violence. I mean, we had a poll just last year that a great many people who are quote unquote conservatives say sometimes it's okay to resort to violence. Well, there is no sometimes resorting to violence. But we have too many politicians elected now who are either afraid or unwilling to call that out and to denounce it and to say that all the time because they want to stay in power and want to keep getting elected. I don't think that there's anything else the president can do. We got everybody? Well, let me just end with this one quick statement. Again, thank you so much for having me here. I always love to come around and hang out with this guy. Great. I've been in this business 47 years, believe it or not. All the way from, again, the Mississippi farm and cotton fields to do some, what I consider to be some certainly gratifying reporting and writing in my career. And I've seen the changes that have happened in this country. I've seen where our political leaders have, in great instances, shown a lot of courage. But I've also seen some who have just given in and says, I'm going to do what's necessary to stay elected. And if it means going against things that I have believed in the past, I'm willing to do that. But I'm also willing to call those folks out because I think that's my job. And so as long as I'm doing this job, I will assure you that I'm going to keep on holding people accountable and seeking the truth and reporting it and trying to help this community have civil conversations with each other about where we're going, because we need strong leadership at every area of our public life. And if we don't get that, then it's, it's almost like a sag in the road. It's going to bring us down. And so I want to thank you all for your questions and your comments. It's just been terrific to be here. And thank you again for the invitation.
And thank you to all who joined us online. And for anyone else, next week we have Tim Vivian, who will be with us both in the forum and throughout the day. And you can find more information under Discover.